At University of Illinois, we have 6 campuses. So when I teach online, I'm teaching students all over the state of Illinois. And that becomes a consideration when forming online groups. Next slide, please. So the objective of this presentation is, upon completion of our session, you're going to be able to describe some effective practices that I've learned for managing groups in an online course. Briefly, we're going to have a little bit of a background on this presentation. I'm going to have slide dividers periodically throughout the presentation. I'll begin by sharing some considerations for designing effective group work. I'll share some selected statements that I use in each syllabus. I will then move into my favorite Blackboard features that are my go-to for pretty much every course I teach. I will incorporate assorted tips and resources toward the end, and then at the very end I will have a takeaway message slide and a slide of references which contains hyperlinks embedded to the sources that I'll cite throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So you saw the lady on the previous slide who looked like she was about to pull her hair out. So sometimes that's how we can feel when we are faced with designing an online course. Particularly this last couple of years in light of COVID, some of the faculty members I work with had never taught online, and I can't imagine the panic they felt trying to adapt to everything almost overnight. Thankfully, I had about 20 years of experience that I could help some of my faculty members and colleagues be able to get up to speed. But that said, I mentioned it's an iterative process and things change pretty quickly all the time, and we have to be ready to adapt. So on this slide, you're going to see the diffusion of innovation theory slide, and you'll see off on the left all of these little icons that suggest a lot of technology. And this is where a lot of our students are coming in with a full grasp of all of these little things we're seeing: how to use Google, how to communicate with a variety of forms of technology. They're pretty familiar with using Twitter and navigating using technology. However, I have very high enrollment online courses that are operated asynchronously. This is a policy that our college has for the graduate program where I teach, that we are attempting to accommodate the working student. So the bulk of my students are working full time. So if I have a class of 168 students, I can count on more than 150 of them are working full time. So that can create its own type of challenge in terms of me modifying things to help students be able to have a good online experience. In this mix, the students all have mixed learning preferences. So this diagram illustrates a lot of things on the left-hand side where some students are coming in very adept at managing technology. But on the far right, I could have a very experienced nurse who's been a nurse practitioner for over 20 years, but they've had very little exposure to working with different software programs and different technology. So these are things that I have to consider when I'm designing groups. So we also have mixed skill levels for handling team conflict. The nurse who has been working for 20 years may be very well seasoned at serving as a charge nurse or a nurse leader, or even running their own practice. But we also have a lot of newer students coming right out of a bachelor's program into a doctoral program with little to no work experience. So I have this mixture, and for those of you who have education backgrounds, you understand that we begin by surveying the needs of our students and asking them what they expect. So I'm a big believer in conducting a lot of surveys with my students. That helps inform me to the demographic I'm dealing with, and I'll talk about that on an upcoming slide. In the College of Nursing, we also have faculty shortages that I'm faced with, and I also have to try to mentor brand new faculty members who are maybe teaching online for the very first time, of encouraging them to follow the model that I've set forth, and that I always tell them there's a method to my madness, and this is what I have learned works best for me after teaching online for about 20 years. So with COVID, we had the sudden transition to online teaching, sometimes resulting in disjointed experiences. Next slide, please. And we have high levels of faculty anxiety, some student burnout and student anxiety. And then we have student expectations that they want to have a very engaging, entertaining learning experience. They want rubrics, they want a minimal amount of readings, no quizzes or tests, and they all want to get an A. This slide gives you some data that was captured in a survey of over 3,000 students during the pandemic. And what they were finding is about 78% of students are saying that the online class experience is unengaging, and about 75% miss the face-to-face interaction with faculty and students. So as we move through this presentation, I'm going to try to give you some tips of how I have tried to consider these things in my courses, particularly during COVID. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that I do a lot of surveying, and this data comes from a course that I taught. I'm sharing some experiences from having taught an informatics course to doctoral students, quality improvement course to doctoral level students, and a health policy course. At the end of the semester, I asked the students, what would you have liked to have spent more time on or less time? And no matter what the course, I tend to notice this pattern. The darker bars represent they want less time on quizzes, less time setting up group expectations and readings. Then scrolling to the bottom of these bars where you see more turquoise, you'll note that most of these things are all how-tos. So the students really seem to like, time and again, no matter what the course, when I assign them how-to activities. More of the demographic over here on the right is a pie chart, which is illustrating that about a fourth of my students in a course of 168 students had less than 2 years nursing experience. So they are lacking the expertise that the other 75% of the students in the course may have. Based on the tips I'm going to give you coming up, you'll see that I really don't get too many complaints about that. Next slide, please. So one thing that I do in all of my courses is I incorporate active learning principles. And if you're not familiar with active learning, we're going to talk about this a little more in the upcoming slides. And I just want to share that research is indicating active learning increases student performance in science, engineering, and mathematics. And nursing is a science degree. And I have seen this to be true. I have modified my teaching style and my teaching approach significantly from how I did it 20 years ago. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into some general theories, models, and frameworks for which you all probably are familiar. I just am mentioning these because these are my go-tos that are a part of every single course I teach. I share this with the students in recorded sessions and incorporate bits and pieces in many lectures to help them understand where they're coming from. In the nursing profession, most nurses are very pragmatic in terms of how they think and how they do their jobs. And they tend to have learning style preferences that are very concrete. Well, as we are teaching students in a doctoral program, We need to move the students up the ladder of learning. And instead of using the typical Bloom's pyramid, I decided that it feels more like we are rolling a heavy giant ball uphill sometimes, trying to get students to shift from concrete thinking and concrete preferences upwards into higher level concepts that are expected in the Bloom's taxonomy. So I try to remind the 25% of the students that we're no longer in the undergrad program where we're memorizing blood gas values and blood parameters and things like that. We are preparing undergrad students to at least perform at the application level in order to pass their licensing exam. So when I get them in grad school, particularly when they've not had much work experience yet, they're hanging on tightly to feel more comfortable and to help reduce anxiety to the application level. And I'm nudging them up the hill with a team. And that's why I'm particularly pleased to present on groups and how I have landed on a few things that have worked for me, because I do believe that the team together help to move, they all help one another out. Next slide, please. So the next slide is talking about the cone of learning, and down at the bottom, you'll see I've got a yellow circle on active learning ideas and ways that we can engage students. And we tend to remember our level of involvement in every course. The level of involvement that I incorporate into my assignments surrounds the lower portion of this pyramid. So I expect students to participate in discussions amongst themselves. Now, I don't tend to use discussion forums in my courses. I've learned that students love to copy and paste, and I wonder what they're learning from that. So I offer a mini lecture with an activity assigned, and they work together. Most of them use a GroupMe phone apps, and they exchange phone numbers, and they discuss the mini lecture and set about delegating responsibilities to one another. And I'll be sharing how we have a peer evaluation process that I incorporate. So I have then a big part of everything I do stimulates the real experience. So I expect them to conduct themselves as if they've already graduated with a doctorate, and that we are simulating in all of our forms of communication what's going to work well in today's fast-paced healthcare environment. So that's where my lens is coming from, preparing future nurse leaders. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we're talking about several theories. I incorporate into many lectures around the third or fourth week of class. I anticipate that the group that they thought was going to be so great, all of a sudden, there's a little bit of anxiety starting to happen. So I share with them, if you're noticing that your group is feeling a little bit of conflict and that things aren't going as well as they were the first couple of weeks, it's because we're in this predictable cycle that is part of Tuckman's theory. And I actually published an article and was asked by the peer reviewers of the journal to provide this very diagram. So I published this in Computers, Informatics, and Nursing a couple of years ago. And so I've taken my 16 weeks and plotted out approximately what I see typically happen with groups, no matter what class where I'm teaching. So what I do during the storm phase is I try to lighten up a little bit on assignments and increase a little bit of the resources that I'm offering that will help them to work through the storm phase. And I'll share examples of those coming up. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with the American Association of American Colleges and Universities, this is a fantastic website to visit to obtain value rubrics. And they have published 16 different value rubrics. I just put snippets from the teamwork value rubric here. These are intended for undergraduate students. And you could somewhat like and benchmark number one as what a freshman undergrad student should be, what level of competency they should be at. And it just says they should be able to share ideas in group or team meetings, but they don't really bother to advance the work of the group. They're just beginning in their college experience. But by the time they're undergrad seniors, they should be able to help the team move forward by articulating the merits of alternative ideas or proposals. So I share these with my doctoral students because it can be kind of humbling if they come in wanting to function at benchmark level 1 and they already have a bachelor's degree and many of them have master's degrees. So the students like rubrics, and I use these as a point of reference. Sometimes around midterm, if I sense that a student might be struggling, I will send the rubric that I think corresponds with where I'm seeing a problem. And I'll say, I'd like you to take a look at this rubric. I've circled where I feel you might be. You circle where you think you are and where you need to go from there. And then we couple that with the other resources that I provide them, which I'll continue to share in the upcoming slides. So next slide, please. Now we're going to transition to some selected statements that I include in every syllabus, no matter which course I'm teaching. Next slide, please. So I incorporate a peer evaluation process, and what I do the first week of class is we have the first 10 days of class is you can add or drop the course. So rather than waste 10 days and not have anything happening, I go ahead and get them started posting a welcome message to their initial group where I have them placed, and I'll show you examples of that in upcoming slides. I talk with them about how we will be communicating with faculty members in the syllabus. I ask them to incorporate a standard naming system on all of their files that they upload for us to grade. I've got that highlighted in yellow here on the lower right. The reason for this is sometimes there are technical difficulties within the system. Students will upload a PDF or they'll upload a Word file. Sometimes pages get separated. If I'm in my office and I want to print something to read it and grade it, scan it and send it back, sometimes the pages get separated and I don't know whose is whose. So this is a standard thing that I do that really saves me time and again by asking students to put this header at the top of their assigned work. I ask the students to role model team steps, effective leadership principles. I'm going to show you some slides from Team Steps. This is a great resource. If you've not been familiar with it in the past, you can go to the website that I'll have embedded the link into my slides. And I can't speak highly enough about this. It's been a wonderful asset to every course I teach. Now, I mentioned I teach health policy, informatics, and quality improvement. Most of those courses are so dense in their own content, there's little room to incorporate anything nice but not necessary. However, in order for the students to work effectively as a group, I find myself teaching leadership skills. Now, we're going to offer a leadership course in their program, but that may not be until they're seniors or about to graduate. So they need something to draw upon to guide them just to get through each course. Most of my students I will have at least in 3 different courses before they graduate. And once they've had me the first time, they kind of know what I'm going to expect and things go pretty smoothly. Particularly after the first course. I tend to overlap pretty heavily in several ways on setting the tone as far as what I expect in terms of following the rules of etiquette. I incorporate a civility statement into my syllabus, and then I incorporate essentials that contain competencies that the doctoral level students are supposed to achieve before they graduate. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a snippet of my first page of my syllabus. And you'll see in red at the top, I always include this statement that this is a roadmap. It's not intended to be like gospel. It's a roadmap to guide you in achieving learning objectives, and it is subject to change, and I'll notify them through Blackboard if I have to make a modification or a change. You'll see that throughout my syllabus, I incorporate hyperlinks so the student, if they're not familiar with active learning and that I'm going to expect them to be actively involved in the course, they can click here and it will take them to a current source of information. Next slide, please. So I have a student courtesy policy. This comes from what's called our Doctor of Nursing Practice, DNP. Essentials, our students are required to be exposed to these competencies and to accomplish them before they earn their doctoral degree. And a lot of what's incorporated into these essentials requires self-reflection. Well, if you go back to Bloom's taxonomy, you'll see that reflection is a good skill for students to practice. I find that I have to embed a link about the difference between a book report and a reflection. And students, by the second or third time they've had me, understand she doesn't want me to just give a little book report here. So I have bullet pointed here how I expect students to communicate when they will be evaluating other members of their group, and to participate in that evaluation and to consistently project an image of a nurse leader. And I use that vocabulary in all of their assigned activities. So they recognize we're simulating now, today, before you graduate, that I expect you to conduct yourself like a future nurse leader. Okay, next slide, please. This is just selected points from the Clark Workplace Civility Index, and it's somewhat of an overlap of the other previous things that I've mentioned. So they're getting the message loudly and clearly that I'm expecting them to conduct themselves like a future nurse leader. So if you're not familiar with this index, I've cited a great source here where you can go to read a full article. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that this is a reflection of my personality. I was getting flooded with a lot of email at some point over the last 20 years. And it's like, how can I rein this in so that I'm not getting 168 emails per day, and that's just one per student in one class? How am I going to rein this in? And so I'm going to share with you in an upcoming slide how I organize course forums and threads and direct them to post their questions onto the course forum. And you can see that it's like a chain of command that I expect them to follow. I had to begin incorporating this into my syllabus because some students feel like I'm busy, I'm working full time. I don't have time to be bothered with going to the course forum. I don't have time to be bothered asking a classmate or reading because we've already established they really don't like to read. And so I'm just going to go straight to the top because it's Sunday night and I'm pressed for time. The assignment's due tomorrow morning. So I've had to help the students understand that in a workplace, you don't just always go straight to the top. You try to solve your problem on on the front lines at first, and then use the system that's in place for you before you go straight to the top. And this, since I've started putting a chain of command in my syllabus with a hyperlink explaining what that means, students seem to respect this. Okay, next slide, please. I mentioned that I am a big believer in using team steps. This can be downloaded as a mobile app. It's great. The students can see very quickly, I'm having problems with how to brief my teammates before we start this next activity, or it's the end of my reign as my 1 week as a nurse leader with my group. What went well and what didn't go so well? So I'm going to have a debriefing. And these are really great and very sound principles that they can access right from a phone app. They bullet point what a description of an effective team leader. Next slide, please. So this slide is just kind of giving them an example of what we're expecting them to do as a leader. Next slide, please. And then here's a sample. There are all kinds of screens built into this Team Steps program, but this is just an example of some tips that they can turn to when they're in the storm phase of their group work. Next slide, please. We're going to transition now into my favorite Blackboard features that I use to help support what I'm doing as a faculty member. So I mentioned that I use course groups. I organize all my students into groups. So if I have 168, I'm going to have more than 30 groups. And this, you can learn more about how to organize groups through the help screens built within Blackboard. Then they have this great feature called Smart Views, which allows me to click and enable Smart Views. So off to the left in that dark gray brown ribbon, I can quickly go to whichever group I want to grade without having to go into the grade book and guess which group they're in. So course group settings and the Smart Views features are wonderful. Next slide, please. This is another one of my favorites, the course reporting system. I will run course reports once I get the gut feeling that a group is not, could we get to the next slide, please? And this is an example of how I weave in a report to help inform me on a group's performance. This particular group, this is an actual report that I ran within the last year on a group that was struggling. And I logged in and I see that they're logging in largely on Saturday, and assignments are due at 9 a.m. Monday morning. And they're supposed to be spending about 10 hours a week in the course. And they're exhausted. They've been working. And so this gives me some behind the scenes information that I can talk with the group about. I'm seeing this pattern that one of your group members is really spending a lot of time in the course. 5 of the group members are not spending as much time, and most of you are logging in on Saturdays. And I use that information to help inform them of some ways to set them up for better success. Next slide, please. Okay, and so we have the course forums. I mentioned that rather than emailing me, I set up a forum that says welcome. I have the students go to that link and post a welcome message to their group. So there'll be one thread per group. They find their thread for their group and say hello to one another. Then I organize by the different modules. Next slide, please. And we'll go on to the next one yet, where it says assignments. So I have assorted tips and resources. I don't do 100% group work. I try to incorporate a few individual assignments, even in a course where I've got over 150 students. That's a lot of individual grading, but it gives me some insight as to students who might be at risk and maybe are kind of under the radar and struggling a little bit. So I do try to incorporate some individual activities. I assure them that their group is going to remain the same for the semester and that we're providing them skills through team steps to help handle any conflict that arises. And it really works pretty well. Next slide, please. This is an example of how I take a whole group of students and I organize them by geographic region when possible. The reason for that is 75% of our students are in the Chicago area, but we have 5 other regions that are more rural, and sometimes these students know one another and they draw a lot of strength from knowing that they have someone in their own town that they can contact and maybe even get together to talk about an assignment. So I organize by specialty and by geographic area. Next slide, please. I try to find ways to connect with my students through announcements. I try to highlight, this wasn't necessarily for extra points, but I just try to say, hey, look, group 5, you have the highest peer ratings for preparing an understandable and effective position statement, according to the instructions that we provided. Next slide, please. These are just a couple of active learning examples. If this is a new thing for you, the notion of active learning, you may think, how do I take what I'm doing and make that active learning? I've provided 2 examples here for you that you can go back and review. Okay, next slide, please. I supplement with a survey link from Qualtrics. I ask the students who are group leaders to go into Qualtrics and rate each of their team members each week on quality, quantity, and timeliness of the work they've done for the group that week. Then across the approximately 12 weeks that this is in place, I have 12 weeks worth of data if someone is consistently not timely in how they work with their group. That gives me added teeth when I need to talk with a student. Your group is anonymously sharing that you could be more timely in participation. I give them the little white boxes where they can add comments, and this mimics a 360-degree feedback that the students get from me at the end of the semester. Next slide, please. The group leader role contributes to points that the students are earning, and you can kind of take a look at this little snippet that I have downloaded into Excel, and you can see how across time a rating of a 3 out of 5 can end up giving the student a score of 75% for their quality, quantity, and timeliness of work that they contributed to their team. So this becomes an individual grade, but it's a grade based on peer comments. Next slide, please. So another thing I try to do, we have no budget for spending a lot of money, but one thing I can do is offer an award, and this is based on peer ratings for the best poster in the class. So I've assigned points that the students are earning throughout the semester, and the team with the highest points, I give them the People's Choice Award certificate. I create a little certificate, email it to the team, and I tell them to list that on their resume as an accomplishment, because there's really not a higher form of peer review than from a group of 160 other members in a class saying, we really thought this was a great poster. So we talk about how to add that to their resume. So we're on to the last slide with some takeaway messages. Successfully managing multiple groups, in my mind, is akin to managing a business. So when I have one class with 168 in it, I feel like I'm running a small corporation. I incorporate a lot of systems to reinforce concepts. I use the team steps, the doctoral essentials, the AACU value rubrics, Bloom's taxonomy, peer evaluations. Those are things that I routinely use to help me be successful. I feel like spending time up front pays off in the long run. So I'm not kidding that the first couple of weeks of class, I'm on there a lot. But I've set the tone, and by about the third week of class, things have started to gel. They're bonding with their group members, and it's just before the storm phase. And so this works pretty well for me to have this type of system. I routinely conduct needs assessments and surveys to help inform how I'm designing a course. To recap, students prefer how-to assignments. Teaching higher order concepts can feel like you're pushing a rock uphill, but a really good team can help lighten everyone's load. The value rubrics can be useful for reinforcing graduate level expectations. Active learning principles can successfully be applied in an online course. I like to incorporate small ways to connect with students, and I feel like the formula for leadership skills plus personal development is going to equal a strong team positioned for career success. Okay, my last slide is my references with hyperlinks embedded, and I believe I'm out of time. So I'm happy to answer questions, and if we need to move to the huddle room, I believe they call it, we can do that. So I'll defer to my producer who will help guide us on answering the questions.
Well, thank you, Janet. Excellent presentation. You've got a number of kudos out there for being very clear and very factual as well. I'm going to start at the bottom and go up in terms of the different items. Kat is saying that I max out groups at 6, but they need to claim their contribution to project by linking or initiating each part they contributed. Another question or comment is, do the group members also provide feedback rather than just the group leaders?
So each member of the team, they take turns serving as group leader. So in a group of 6, they're going to serve as leader 2 times over a 12-week period. And everybody takes turns, and I let them sign up. If they need to change, any of that's okay with me, so long as they serve 2 times. And I have a rubric of criteria that I require they follow, which I'd be happy to share. I believe my email address is on my first slide. So if you specifically would like to see the rubric that I create for the group leaders, I'm happy to share that. I hold their feet to the fire on this because I've had group leaders who sign up and absolutely didn't even serve as leader. I've had them go off on international vacations when they're serving as leader, and that's a huge hit to their grade. And it really helps introduce a bell curve to the grading system, because I feel like if the students follow what I give them, everybody it can easily get an A. But some students really want to kind of test the waters, and maybe they don't deserve the A that the other group members earned. And so this is a way that it introduces a bell curve. So they're supposed to take turns. They need to provide written comments to substantiate why they rated a group member with a 5 out of 5 versus a 3 out of 5 or a 2 out of 5. The ratings tend to be pretty fair, and what I'm observing as a seasoned faculty member, I pick up on a lot the first week of class, and I already kind of begin with a watch list of who I think might be at risk, that based on the kind of questions asked, I can kind of gauge their anxiety level, their level of experience. Anxiety has been really high during COVID. I'm not sure if I answered all of those questions.
One of the other questions is 6 a good number? I'm assuming you use 6
Yes.
in a group because that number just works out nicely for the number of students you have.
Yes.
But can you comment on 6?
6 is what I feel is ideal. It works out because I try to have the group leaders for 12 weeks, and it's a year. I have had times occasionally where I have a lesser enrollment, and I'll create groups more by specialty or region, and I will run them down to 4, group sizes of 4. So every time I have a group, that is an assignment that I'm grading. So I like to try to keep the numbers of groups manageable for me to grade. So there's a lot that kind of goes into what's the course I'm teaching, what am I going to expect them to do, but 4 to 6 is good. For me, 6 is ideal.
Janet, we're getting some comments that the PDF that you shared, the hot links aren't working. So if it would be possible to revise or redo that PDF to make sure that the links do work. And I'm assuming too that you mentioned your emails on the first slide, that somebody, if they really want the slide deck and have those links available, that they could email you and get those from you.
Yes. So I was asked to upload my slides in PDF format, and all of those links were working. I'm kind of wondering if I'm happy to resubmit or just share the PowerPoint slides, not converted into PDF, because...
Yeah. Janet, even if you could put it out on a cloud drive and make it shareable.
Sure.
Pass that link along to people that would like it, that would be helpful.
Yes, I'm happy.
We're going to ask them to email you for that. Right?
Okay. Yeah, happy to do that.
I'm going to just end with one question from Ken. He says, the competitive and almost cutthroat nature of this feels very nursing oriented, as opposed to some of the everyone exceeds stuff that he's gotten through his MED courses. Do you think this is something that could be applied to, say, a humanities or coding course?
So I'm not sure if the person is asking about, does active learning work in coding? My son is a programmer, so I'm pretty familiar. Yes, I think it would work in a coding course. My own son had group projects in his computer science degree, and he has a mathematics degree. So yeah, it definitely can work. Humanities, as I said, I was an early adopter of online learning. Part of that was born out of, I live in a rural area. And every time that I could do something online and I didn't have to drive 100 miles round trip or 400 miles round trip, that's what I opted for. So I make active learning work for me because it's in my best interest. I think it definitely has a place for everyone, and I'd be happy to chat a little bit further by email with the person who posted the question. If I didn't thoroughly answer that, I really do believe active learning has a place in everything. I teach data mining with active learning and using groups, writing policy briefs, creating posters. I do a lot of things where I expect students to work together. And I do have them share in their uploads, put your initials next to the part where you contributed, so I can kind of gauge who did what on each assignment.
All right, very good. Janet, you're getting, again, a lot of good feedback, enjoying your presentation, etc. And again, for the rest of you, if you want to be in touch with Janet, her email address I have up on the screen right now, and be in touch with her. It sounds to me, Janet, that you're open to people contacting
Oh, yes.
So again, Janet, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for joining the session today. And again, the recording will be out there through the end of November, and then I think it'll get transferred into the community site for Blackboard. So again, everybody, have a good day. Janet, thank you. See you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great week.